afternoon. Welcome to Sociology 1 here at Yuba College. We're going to kind of pick up where we left off the other day, which is we were talking about binge drinking. And the reason we were trying to illustrate all the key terms. So if you remember, we talked about sociological imagination, social structure, social facts, theories, and that's that. And then we talked about binge drinking. And we tried to show that that social structure really matters there. Well, we illustrate the idea of data and theory, and the idea that social structure matters. Where people are in the structure has a big impact on their likelihood of binge drinking at a college campus. I just wanted to say a few more things about it. One is, well, what would be the solution then if, what was I don't know if that we actually identified a theory. But if it's true that upper middle class white males and females and upper middle class Asian females and males are among the most likely to binge drink, and working class Latinos and Asians and black people are the least likely to binge drink, what theory does that lead you to as far as why it happens on college campuses, or what is a leading cause of the binge drinking? To relieve stress? Well, so there again, I would question why you feel the most privileged people with the most resources are the most stressed compared to people with the least resources. Working class people probably come to college with no parent that's been to college, with not enough money for college, and they're the ones not binge drinking, whereas the ones whose parents have plenty of money and they've got plenty of experience with college, they're the ones who are drinking. Maybe it's more competitive at the top, but probably a better theory is, and if we look at who's drinking and why in particular, I think we mentioned this, it's frats and sororities. That's where the drinking's going on. It's not the really studious students that are at the library worried about getting into Stanford graduate school that are the ones doing the drinking. It's sororities and fraternities is where binge drinking goes on. So if you were trying to manage a college and you were trying to reduce the binge drinking, trying to reduce the stress on college campus probably wouldn't reduce the binge drinking very quickly. But reducing the number of fraternities and sororities probably would get rid of a lot of the binge drinking. But that hasn't really happened, and that tells you how much power a lot of fraternities and sororities have, and their alumni have, and most colleges are, even though they know that's the source of the problem in most cases, or the major source of the problem, but we can't go just get rid of our frats and sororities because the powerful people who are in them would, probably find ways to, retaliate in some way, like not donate money to the school and things like that. So college presidents got together a few years ago. I think it was about 100 college presidents who all recognized binge drinking as a problem. No college president wants people dying or being raped or being poisoned by alcohol on their campus. But they can't really get rid of the cause of it. So what can they do? Well, they took out a letter. They took out an ad. They paid for an ad to run in major newspapers around the country where they wrote a letter together saying, we, these college presidents, this is what we think should happen to deal with the binge drinking problem. And they said, so what's the solution to binge drinking? They said, how about let's lower the drinking age? They said, let's lower the drinking age to 18. Does that sound like it would work to you?
Nope.
Why not?
More people have access to it.
Well, they're basically saying, let's give 18-year-olds access to alcohol. That's how we'll stop them from binge drinking. Why do you think they would say that? I mean, you don't agree with it, but they're college presidents. They're well-educated people, well-versed in the research on binge drinking and who does it and why.
To get a perspective other than, although weird, you can get a perspective of work experience, where the sooner you expose them to the effects and that idea, the quicker they can get used to it and the quicker they become more responsible.
Well, and as these college presidents pointed out, throughout Europe, there aren't binge drinking problems like they have here. Plenty of Europeans go to college, and when they go to college, they don't all get drunk and crazy. So what's the difference between Europe and here? Well, one difference is many European countries don't have a drinking age. And so people learn earlier on how to drink, how to handle their alcohol. They don't see it as a forbidden fruit they don't go crazy with it once they get access to it. It's just a normal part of life by the time they get to college, and they don't think it's this special great thing they get to do once they're at college. So that was the argument these college presidents made. A lot of Americans go, yeah, but this is America, you know, we wouldn't want to do that here. And so that makes me think maybe there's an underlying reason that these college presidents proposed that. And again, I'm trying to get you to think sociologically here. Are there other reasons college presidents might want to lower the drinking age, even if it's not the one they're saying, so that we can be like Europe because it'll be better for the kids? Is that what they really mean?
They're getting money from alcohol companies.
No, that would be a very cynical reason why they are. I doubt some college presidents might. Chancellor of Davis had to step down recently, partly because of money she was getting from industry, in this case textbook industry, and people said, why are you taking money from the textbook industry when they're the industry making money off the students? So she got in some trouble for that. But I don't know too many college presidents that would willingly take money from the alcohol industry. They would lose a lot more than their job from that, probably. They would never get to work again in higher education. So I doubt that. That's very cynical of you to think that, but it's possible. But
they don't have to deal with the problem of underage drinking.
Well, in other words, they want to deal with the problem of drinking, over drinking, as their own college issue. If it's a law that's being broken, an underage drinking law, then the cops deal with it. Then the power to deal with it is in the cops' hands. If I'm a college president, if the power to discipline people for drinking too much is in my hands, that's better for me as a college, because one thing college presidents hate is when they get a call from the cops saying, yeah, we have some of your students down here in the drunk tank, or we have arrested your students. Then that college president, what does he have to do? Call the parents. Your child was arrested at Stanford today. I'm paying how much for my kid to go to Stanford and you let him get arrested? What do you mean, because he was drinking? I did that at Stanford. And now they get arrested? What are you talking about? He's never going to get into med school with, so the point is rich, powerful parents don't want to see their kids arrested. Rich, powerful college presidents don't want to see their students being arrested. So if you change the law and say, well, drinking in college isn't illegal, then it becomes a discipline problem within the college. If people are doing bad stuff, we'll handle it. But we don't want the cops on campus. So it's a little lesson there, I think, in power and, people wanting to have the power to control their interests. And I went to a very elite school, a very expensive school on the East Coast. I was able to go to very wealthy kids there from like Pillsbury family and other kinds of families like that, the Pillsbury family. And that school had its own police force. It was called public safety. And they weren't hired by the state. They were just hired by that college. And so if kids were doing things that were against the law, the first people to handle it was the public safety force. And almost never did they call the cops. So people might be doing very illegal things at that school, and I don't want to badmouth my own school, but people used to do illegal things there, and very rarely did they get arrested because the school, being a very wealthy place with powerful people's children, didn't want their children being arrested. Now, the townies, the people in town, and they were called townies, they would get arrested for those things. They didn't have power and privilege. So that's just a little lesson. Part of what sociology is all about is studying power, especially the first type of sociology that we're going to look at. Oh, by the way, so what does work, actually? Some colleges have tried to reduce their binge drinking. And what works, actually? What about posting accurate information? If you simply post posters around the college, and when I say accurate information, well, when they post posters that say things like, did you know that only 10% of college students binge drink? Or you post something like that. Like, did you know only 10% of your classmates are going to get drunk tonight? When you post that information around the campus, binge drinking rates go way down. Why would that be? So you're not threatening them. You're not saying we're going to arrest you if you do it. We're not saying we're going to send a letter to your parents if you do it. They're simply saying only 10% of people do it. And then people stop doing it. Why would that be?
They don't want to be a statistic.
Well, they don't want to be in the minority. 10% is a small minority of the population. So if 10% of the people are the weirdos getting drunk, You might say to yourself, do I want to be the weirdo getting drunk, the 10%, or do I want to be with the 90% of people who aren't getting drunk tonight? And it's a very powerful point, and I think a very important sociological one, that one of the main features driving human beings is wanting to be accepted and respected by our group. And if we're looked down upon or thought of as weird or thought of as not normal, it's very uncomfortable for us. And so that desire to fit in, to be considered normal and not a weirdo, is a really powerful force. We're not that afraid of going to jail. If they say, we're going to arrest you if you drink, people are like, yeah, fine, go ahead, try it. But if they say, a lot of people are going to think you're a weirdo if you do it, and people are like, okay, I won't. So it's a very important point that we want to fit in. We want social solidarity. I brought up that term the other day, to be connected to others and be part of the group. And when the group says, you're not one of us, you're out there, we're not that happy about it. So anyway, so I think that's important too, because Americans tend to think the way to get Americans to behave right is to scare them. If you just make the punishment higher, they just won't do it. And I don't see much evidence of that. We have a lot of punishments in America, and people still do those things. But when you try to persuade people that the reason you shouldn't do it is because other people will think you're weird or not like you or not want you to be part of their group, that's a much more powerful motivation in general to get people to behave themselves. Anyway, so what is sociology? That's our next real question. And I'm putting this one as more of like a capital S sociology, because we've already been introduced to the idea of the sociological imagination, which is kind of like small s sociology that all of us can do. And you're starting to do that, hopefully, or you're starting to learn how to do that, like thinking about being a college student. And but what is capital S sociology? And one definition of it is to say that we study the study of modern society. I mean, the most general definition of sociology is that it's the study of society, but that's not a very accurate definition, because there are other fields in a college and university that also study society. Anthropology, for example, which is a course that I think is taught in here after this one, that studies society, but they generally study what are called non-modern societies or traditional societies, like tribes and others that are not part of the modern world. And there's like historians that study like ancient society and medieval society, and and economists that study society. So what is it that sociologists study that makes us sociologists? And it's more accurate to say, we study modern society. So what is modern society? And I'd like to start our whole class off by trying to understand what is modernity. And a good place to start that discussion is with this number, 1492. In rhyme, if you could tell me, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You knew that little rhyme, some of you. Well, in other words, in 1492, that's when the New World was discovered. And you can pretty much accurately say that that's the beginning of the modern era. Before that is kind of medieval times, for a few hundred years before that, or Middle Ages. And that goes back to like the year 0 of Jesus Christ being born. Before Jesus Christ, that's ancient times. And again, we don't study ancient society in sociology. The Romans had a very developed society. The Greeks and the Egyptians and the Carthaginians had very developed societies. But we don't study those in sociology, really. Ancient civilization is studied in other fields like archaeology and antiquities and other places where you would study that stuff. Medieval society was also very interesting. Today, Americans love their Games of Thrones and their Harry Potters and their Lords of the Rings and all kinds of Middle Ages, medieval stuff. But that's not what sociology studies either. You can go study medieval stuff, but not in a sociology classroom very well. We tend to focus on society after 1492, the modern era, what I would prefer to call modernity. And so modernity is a time period. It's planet Earth after 1492, but it's also accurate to say that not the whole world is not yet modern, that there's parts of planet Earth today that still aren't part of modernity. I was just reading an article in New Yorker magazine about these tribes in Brazil that are barely having contact with the European world, and they still live like hunters and gatherers did thousands of years ago in other places. And so not the whole world isn't modern yet, but sociology, and again, archaeologists and anthropologists, or well, anthropologists might study those tribes in Brazil right now, but sociologists probably wouldn't. We don't have much to say about what we call primitive or simple societies. We study more modern society. So what is modern? Well, 1492, I think, is an important year to consider. When Columbus discovered America, it had a big transformative effect on Europe and on the world itself. Well, a transformative effect on the New World, too, obviously. Why such a transformative effect? I'd like you to try to imagine right now, what if you woke up tomorrow morning and read in the paper or saw on the news that they discovered a whole new planet Earth, and it's right behind the moon. We didn't know, but this whole time there was a big planet Earth right behind the moon, and we just couldn't see it all this time. But it's got air, it's got oceans, it's got forests, it's just as big as Earth. Would anything change here on Earth if suddenly they discovered another planet Earth? Yeah, things would change dramatically. What?
Planet vacation.
Well, not just vacations. I think lots of people would start talking about, well, can I move there? What's over there? Whole populations from here would go there. The population here would be reduced. The population there would grow. We'd stop worrying about global warming here because we wouldn't need to worry about it anymore probably because we got a whole other place to go to, and all kinds of changes would happen. And all our political discussions would change, and all our culture and art and science would change, and all kinds of things would begin changing because there's a whole new world out there. Well, that's what happened in 1492. They're like, wait, there's not only a whole other continent like Europe, there's two of them with a thing in between. It's huge. It's bigger than anything we knew. There's not only a whole other continent out there, there's a whole other world bigger than the world we already have over here. All they knew about was like Asia and Europe and a little bit of Africa, but now there's like this whole other continents out there. And that set off a series of revolutions. And those revolutions are what produced the modern world, and those revolutions are what produced sociology as well. What revolutions am I talking about? Well, for one thing, the scientific revolution. That's one of the main things that happened, is that by discovering the New World, Columbus showed there's all kinds of stuff to discover. People didn't know really about discovering before this. Before this, the Catholic Church controlled all knowledge. And if you ever wondered what was going on in the world, why do things do what they do, you went and asked the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church says, well, don't worry, we know everything. We know what the sun is. We know what the stars are. We know what Earth is. Don't worry, we know it all. It's all been revealed already. It's all in the Bible already. Well, they said, the world is flat, according to the Bible, and that's just how it is. And when Columbus said, I think it might be round, or Galileo said, I think it might be round, they said, well, we'll kill you for saying that. So when Columbus discovers it is round, it's not what the Catholic Church says. And if we can discover that it's round, what else can we discover? And a whole bunch of new discoveries started happening. People are like, well, you can discover new planets, actually. We're not the only planet in the solar system. We actually go around the sun. The sun doesn't go around us. So all these things that people believed to be true, because the Catholic Church told them it was true, suddenly became not true. And suddenly people started to ask, well, what else is the Catholic Church not know that we can discover? And so people start using telescopes and microscopes. What about really small stuff? We can discover things that are really tiny that we didn't know were there. We can discover all kinds of things. And the age of discovery began after this. And the whole idea that science might be a better way to know things than religion. In other words, people believed up until then, the religious people, the priests, they know everything. And now it was pretty clear they didn't. And who did know stuff? The discoverers, the scientists, the people out there trying to pick things apart and figure things out, not just read a Bible. And so that scientific revolution, we're still experiencing it. All the things science can discover has, taken off in the world. But that scientific revolution also helped lead to some political revolutions. The Catholic Church not only dominated knowledge at the time, But it kind of dominated politics because the kings and queens that were in charge of everything, if you ever asked as a citizen, well, why do they get to be in charge? Why do they get to run the show and call all the shots? And the church would always say, because they're descended from God. They're divine. You're just a common person. You're just normal and regular, but they're like gods. And so you better listen to them, and that's why they get to be king and you don't. Well, now people stop believing the church. They said, we don't believe you that the world's flat anymore, and we also don't believe you that the kings and queens are very special. So actually, we're going to overthrow them. In fact, we're going to kill them. So France killed their kings and queens, and England said we're going to strip the king and queen of their power. They can still be king and queen, but they don't get to do anything or say anything. In America, we said talk to the hand. We're not listening to the king anymore. We're starting our own constitution, our own Congress. So these political revolutions that overthrew the kings and queens of Europe was directly related to the scientific revolution that was related to the discovery of the New World. And then also the Industrial Revolution. Once you could discover new things, and once people were free of kings and queens to be able to go and try new things and new ways of making things and new ways of transporting things, then a whole new Industrial Revolution happened, and coal power was discovered, and electric power, and all those things. And if we're talking about a modern world, what makes our world modern is that it's scientific and industrialized and democratic. And those are the things that those are some of the main elements of a modern society. And so Europe became quite modern pretty quickly. The United States, America became quite modern. Parts of Asia did. But still the modern revolutions are ongoing, and you can still see some of the conflicts in today's world. Is it really between Islam and Christianity? I don't think so. I don't see it that way. Big conflict today is really between parts of the world where people want to keep things non-modern, keep things religious and non-scientific and non-industrialized. There's people that feel that's the better way to go, and they want to keep their place of the world that way. And there's other people that are still trying to modernize the world and want to bring science and technology and democracy to these other places. So you can see the conflicts on today's world as still about this question of how modern should we be. But sociology, too, is a product of all of this. Sociology grows up as a science, part of the scientific revolution. But sociology is, in some sense, a product of the modern world, but it's also looking back at the modern world and trying to understand it. Sociology isn't totally sure that this new modern, scientific, industrialized, democratic world is perfect. In fact, we're pretty sure there's quite a few problems with it. And so sociology is a science, and in that sense, it's happy that the modern world is here. But it's also a skeptical science that tries to look at the modern world and ask, well, is it perfect? What's wrong with it? What can we do to make it better? How can we fix it? And so the beginnings of sociology weren't right in 1492. I mean, I'm covering a lot of centuries here. But, the discoveries happened, the revolutions happened, universities and things were created. Eventually, in the 1850s, so about 200, 300 years later, is when you start seeing the development of sociology. And I want to talk now about the founding fathers. We call them the founding fathers of sociology. It's a misnomer because that term really comes from the American Revolution and the founding fathers of America. But like that phrase, it's also a sexist one because it ignores the women and mothers who helped create not only America, but helped create sociology. But I do start with that idea, and I want to start with them, the founding fathers, as doctors. Now I'm putting that in quote because they weren't doctors either. They weren't medical doctors. They were philosophers and scientists. But in thinking about why did they create sociology, that's the question we're asking. What is sociology, and why did these men decide we need this thing, this science called sociology? They did it, you could think of it this way, that they thought of the modern world as sick, that this new world that was coming into being wasn't quite healthy. It was a sick puppy, and they wanted to help this sick puppy become healthier. And so in their analysis of what's wrong with the modern world, they were kind of looking at it like doctors would. Like, there's a sick patient here, and we got to figure out how to make it well. And that's, in a sense, what sociology is trying to do, fix this sick patient called the modern world. And so we're going to draw a table. This table I referred to as the Founding Fathers as doctors table. And I'm going to type it up, or I have a typed version of it that I will make available to you. But I'd like you to follow along with me as we create the table, because that'll, I think, help you understand it. So first of all are the Founding Fathers. Karl Marx is one of them. He is one of the most famous sociologists, probably the most famous sociologist. How many have ever heard of Karl Marx? How many have heard of Marxism? What's Marxism? Oh, that's a big question. Karl Marx is a bad word. In America for a long time, if you went around with a Karl Marx t-shirt or something like that, people would think you were a bad guy. And Karl Marx was not allowed to be taught in school. And if you were like teaching Karl Marx's writings in school, people would maybe even arrest you, maybe charge you with corrupting the minds of the young. So Karl Marx is a dangerous thinker. Why? Because not only is he the father of sociology, one of them, he's also the father of communism. And communism, as you may know, is an ideology and political system that America defined as an evil thing for many years. And we fought a Cold War for 50 years where we defined ourselves as the free world, and we thought of ourselves as being in opposition to the communist world. And some of you in this classroom may have fled countries that were taken over by communists. And in your own experience, you may think of communists as bad, evil people that are trying to take away your freedom and ruin your life. I'm not going to talk about communism really, but the political movement. And Karl Marx is considered the founding father of that. But you should know that Karl Marx once also famously said, "I'm not a Marxist," meaning he didn't always agree with what his followers did. So there were a lot of people that took his name and said they were trying to make his ideas come true, and he looked at what they were doing and sometimes said, "I don't follow you. I'm not a Marxist. If that's what a Marxist is, I'm not one." So the way I would like to put it is, Karl Marx is both a thinker, a philosopher, and a political activist. He was interested in communism and making communism happen. But that's not the Karl Marx we're going to spend much time talking about. The other side of that same man is that he was a thinker that analyzed our capitalist world that we live in. And his analysis of what's wrong with capitalism is still read today by many people. And a big new book came out recently called Capital, and Marx's big book was called Capital. And that new book that just came out, lots of people in reading, including Bill Gates, the leader of Microsoft, one of the richest man on earth, and he said it was a great book, and it was very Marxist in its way of thinking. So even though communism has a bad name, and Karl Marx used to be considered a bad guy, I want you to think of him as just one of the founding fathers of sociology and take his ideas seriously, and hope I'm not trying to corrupt you or something like that. But maybe I am. I don't know. But he's one of them, and he's first because he wrote first, and he was born before the other two. I'm not writing down their birth and death dates here because I don't think that's that important. But Karl Marx did most of his writing from about 1840 till, I don't know, about 1870 or so. That was his productive period in there somewhere. The next guy is Emile Durkheim. We met Durkheim earlier when we were talking about social facts. He is one of the founding fathers of sociology, but he's also one of the founding fathers of statistics. And we learned earlier about his pioneering work in showing how you could count up things like suicides and analyze interesting things about human beings. Durkheim's not as famous as Marx. Most people who aren't sociologists never heard of Durkheim. He didn't have huge numbers of followers that did things in his name. There was no movement called Durkheimianism. But he was writing a little bit after Marx, and so he had the benefit of kind of hindsight of being able to read what Marx said and build his own theories kind of in an argument with Marx and say, well, hey, Marx, you're wrong about this, this, and that, and here's why. So he's kind of like 1860 till, I don't know, about 1880. I hope I'm getting these years generally right. Weber is the third one. It's spelled like Weber, like your grill, like a Weber grill, but in sociology, we're kind of pretentious, so we pronounce it in the German way, Weber. He was German. Durkheim, by the way, that's a German-sounding name, but he was French. And Karl Marx was born in Germany, but he was kicked out of Germany because he was a communist, and he lived out most of his life in England. So those are the three guys. And Weber wrote from about 1870, I'll say, till about 1910 or so. So he wrote a little bit into the 20th century, and he had the most benefit of hindsight that he could read both what Marx and Durkheim said and build his theories as a kind of opposition to them or a correction of them. But all three of them agreed that the modern world was kind of sick. And if you want to understand, well, before I start talking about that, let's talk about what are the columns going to be. So this is the Founding Fathers, is the name of this column. The next column is, what is their, the illness? What is the name of the illness that they think is affecting modern society or infecting modern society? The next are the symptoms. What signs are there that society is sick and not doing too well? What is the prognosis? Where will this disease be headed as society gets sicker and sicker? Where is it going? And then finally, each of them had some ideas about how you could cure society. So again, they didn't use these terminology. They didn't say, here's the illness, here's my diagnosis, here's the cure, that kind of thing. We now, in retrospect, can look at their work and compare it by using this kind of analytical framework and say that they are kind of like doctors. And they all agreed that the modern world was sick. I don't know if you can put yourself in their shoes. Marx was writing in England. Remember I said he got exiled to England. He had a buddy named Engels. Engels had money and was rich, so Engels just basically helped support Marx, paid him a monthly stipend, while Marx wrote and sat in the library in London, or the museum in London actually, and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. In Capital, his most famous book is like 3 volumes, and it's like well over 1,000 pages long. So he did a lot of writing. But what was London like? If you were to go back to London in 1850, what signs would there be that this was not a healthy, happy society? Well, first of all, if you went to the East End of London, if you went to where capitalism was happening, where all the new factories were being created, first of all, you wouldn't know it was night or day. Why wouldn't you know if it was night or day?
Smoke.
Because all the factories were coal-fired with the dirtiest smoke ever, and the smoke is pouring out 24/7, and so all of Manchester, England is shrouded in black smoke all day long every day. And so you can't tell if it's night or day. As you're walking to the factory, you'd be walking through raw sewage because they didn't have sewers back then, and you had thousands of workers all working in the factory, living in these tenement houses, and the sewage is just running in the streets. And you walk through the sewage to get to work. When you get to the work, well, who would you see working in these big factories at the machines? And by the way, how many hours a day did they work? They got there at 6 in the morning and they left at 10 at night. So you're working a 16-hour day in the factory. And who's working there? 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds. So you'd have to be a pretty heartless person to go to Manchester, England and say, looking good. Looking like a healthy America to me, a healthy England to me. Almost any thinking person who wasn't a businessman, the businessmen making money are like, this looks great, we're getting rich here. But people with other interests besides making money, looking at it going, this doesn't seem like a great modern world that's so much better than the medieval world. And so all of them agreed. Marx agreed, Durkheim agreed, Weber agreed that there's something sick about this new industrialized world that people are living in. But what is the cause of the sickness? Marx thinks the cause of it is capitalism. It's this new economic system, and we're going to learn a lot more about Marx's analysis of that economic system when we get to conflict theory. But for now, just say he was blaming the system. He says the system that we've created leads to this. And what are the symptoms of a capitalist system being sick? He mentions 2. He calls them alienation. I'm going to write them over here so you can see it bigger. Alienation is one symptom, and exploitation is another. Exploitation is when your work doesn't benefit you, it benefits somebody else. If you work 16 hours a day in the factory, you're pouring a lot of blood, sweat, tears, time, you're losing a lot of sleep, you're putting a lot of your life energy into making a product. But who gets the value of that product? Who gets to drive it home? And let's say you're making a car. Well, the capitalist gets most of the money. You get paid a little wage, you get paid, a couple dollars for your work for the day, but the capitalist who owns the factory, he gets a lot of money. The investors who invest in the company, they get a lot of money. And so they're not doing the work. According to Marx, the people doing the work in capitalism are being exploited. They're getting paid very little. And the people not doing the work, people sitting around, are getting all the money. And that is exploitative. And the only way that system works is if there's people who are so starving and so destitute that they're willing to work for somebody else and give that person all their energy. Most of us would probably rather put all our energy into a product we get to sell and make all the money. So why would we put all our energy into a product somebody else gets to sell and make all the money? That's exploitation, and Marx says that's a sick society where most people, most of the day, are making somebody else rich off their hard labor. And alienation is another problem with capitalism. According to Marx, what makes humans human is our labor. We love to produce. According to Marx, what makes humans human is our ability to be creative producers. In other words, he thinks what really makes a human is when you have this idea in your head, and then you make that idea become real. I just saw somebody yawn. College tends to be a pretty boring, college classroom tends to be a boring place. Why? Because you're not being creative right now. You're just writing down somebody else's thoughts, somebody else's lecture that I decide to give, and you just have to copy it down and spit it back out. That's not very creative, and you probably get pretty alienated right now sitting here, and you probably feel like you can feel your own mind leave your body and watch you sitting there taking notes, and your own mind is somewhere else, because your mind is much more creative than just listening and writing down what somebody told you. But again, in the capitalist world, a lot of the time we're spent doing something somebody else told us to do it how they told us to do it, and we don't get to be creative. It's not our product that we get to help make in the factory. We don't get to decide how to make it. We don't get to decide when to make it. But human beings, what we like to do is create things. And all of us would. When you pick out an outfit in the morning, you have an idea for an outfit, and then you make it a reality. When you plan a party, you've got this idea, and then you make it happen. When you write a book, I've got a great idea for a book, make it happen. I got a movie, I got a picture I want to draw. That's creativity, and according to Marx, all human beings are creative. That's one of the skills we have that makes us human. Dogs aren't creative, really. Owls, might make nests, but they're not creative about it. It's just instinct, and all owls make the same nest. But human beings, we're individually creative, and he says we feel most human when we're being creative. When we get to decide the things we're creating and how we create them, we feel really happy being human at that time. That's why a lot of people want to be artists or want to be self-employed or want to be doing something that's creative, where it's them. Not, you do this, this, and that. And you sit there for 18 hours hammering the nail in the factory, the same nail over and over. And Marx said any kind of job that makes me be like an animal is not a human job. And according to Marx, in the capitalist world, most people back then never get to be human. So you're at your job 16 hours a day and you're being like a machine. And then you get to go home, and when you get to go home, you get to eat and sleep, maybe sleep, but you only have 6 hours to sleep if you're working like 16-hour day. If you maybe get to sleep, you maybe get to go to the bathroom, you maybe get to have a little sex with the wife. But those are all things, according to Marx, that all animals do. All animals eat and sleep and go to the bathroom and stuff. So if you're a machine all day and you're an animal at home, when did you get to be a full human being that's creative, that gets to think for itself, that gets to make its own things, that gets to show pride in its own creative work? And so Marx says that's a sick society where most people, most of the time, aren't getting to be human.
If he's the father of communism, isn't that kind of an opposite idea to that?
Well, like I said, Karl Marx said, I'm not a Marxist. So people that created quote-unquote communist societies and deprived people of a lot of freedom, that's not what Marx had in mind for a communist society. We'll talk later about what he had in mind for a communist society. But in his mind, it would be a world where most of us had a lot more control over our work, and we didn't have to work 16 hours a day. We'd work maybe 5 hours a day or 4 hours a day and get to spend a lot of other time being very creative. So he wanted a world, in his mind, communism is a world where we're cooperating to make life more human for all of us. Whereas capitalism is a society where we're all competing, where some people get to be human and most people get to work for them. So Marx, yeah, you've grown up in a capitalist society that sees communism as a bad thing, and we're taught in school it's a bad thing, and we're taught in school that we should have hated communism and it's the worst thing ever. My current partner grew up in the Soviet Union when it was a communist country run by Marxists. She misses it, actually. So when we hear that communism is a terrible thing, do we really know people that grew up in communism? Now, granted, she was part of the kind of elite class of communism, so she had it pretty good. But what I'm saying is and even the Soviet Union, a lot of what's wrong with the Soviet Union is still wrong with Russia today, even though it's not a communist country anymore. So a lot of the problems that you could point to, like Stalin killing millions of people in Russia, was that a communist thing or was that a Russian thing to do? I don't know. But anyway, yeah, so actually existing communism in the world hasn't always been a wonderful place to live. I agree with you. But what Marx is talking about is what was wrong with capitalism and trying to overcome that. So those are his two symptoms. The prognosis is what he calls polarization. And I'll write that bigger over here. So prognosis, these are the symptoms. Prognosis is polarization. Polarization is when things split into two. In this case, we're talking about the world splitting into haves and have-nots. Ultimately, capitalism's downfall, according to Marx, is it just doesn't provide enough for enough people. You end up with a very small group of people that are the haves, and a very large group that are the have-nots. And the have groups tends to get smaller over time. And as it gets smaller, it gets richer and richer and richer. And this big group down here gets larger and larger. And as it gets larger, it gets poorer and poorer and poorer. And that's ultimately the sign of a sick society. If it pulls into just a few people have everything and the rest of the people have nothing, that's not a society that in his view is going to survive anyway. The many are going to eventually overthrow the few because they have to. And so Marx says, that's ultimately what's wrong with this system is it concentrates wealth. Very few people end up getting all the wealth. And you can just imagine if you have a factory of 1,000 people and they're working all day to make the investors rich. Just a single factory is like that. All these people working really hard and all the wealth going to the top, while these people just get a little bit of wage and this guy gets the top. Over time, as you keep doing that, you're going to have a society that ends up that way. So Marx says that's the prediction, that's the prognosis of where capitalism is headed. So what's the cure? Well, the cure is going to come whether capitalists like it or not, which is a working class revolution, a worker revolution. When all those people in the factories realize, hey, we're the ones making the wealth, what are the investors doing? Well, they're taking the wealth. Well, what if we don't give it to them? What if we stop making the wealth for the investors and we keep the wealth for ourselves? Then we workers are going to be a lot better off. We'll work ourselves a lot less. We'll make our working conditions a lot better. We'll give ourselves much more creative opportunity to change tasks and learn new jobs and things. So we'll get to be human finally and not just be slaves to these capitalists. So Marx figured that would eventually happen. And when that happens, we'll be in a whole new kind of society called communist society. So ultimately what he meant by communist society is a society run by workers in favor of working people rather than a society run by capitalists in favor of the capitalists. And we'll talk more about that later on. Well, Durkheim was living in the same basic world as Marx. As I pointed out, their lives overlap to some extent. But Durkheim disagreed with Marx that capitalism as the system is the cause of this mistreatment of people by other people. If capitalists are making people work 16 hours a day, and they're making children work 16 hours a day under terrible conditions, according to Durkheim, it's not a system that causes that. It's not having morals that causes that. If you look at a child and think, I'll just work that kid till he dies, and that might be age 10, and then I'll go find some other orphan with no kids and make him work for me until he's 10, and then he's done, and I go get another one. That's heartlessness. That's immorality, according to Durkheim. That's not feeling like the person you're working hard as a fellow human being. It's seeing them as just trash to be used for your own purposes. And Durkheim says if we've gotten to a point in human life where people see each other as trash to be used and abused and discarded, then that's a moral problem with humanity, not a systemic problem. And changing the system might not change our morality that much. So according to him, that's the real issue, is why are people mistreating each other in this way, using each other for their own purposes? That's the immoral thing. And so he defines it as, I don't want to get the, well, he calls it the complex division of labor. I'll write that over here. So the sickness for Durkheim, or the illness, is the complex division of labor. A division of labor is when a society has to divide up who does what. And that's what we mean by a division of labor. There's things that need to get made and other things that need to get done, and who does what is a division of labor. And when he says it's complex today, or in the modern world, he's really comparing, say, a village versus a city. A village has a simple division of labor. If you grow up in a village, or you live in a village in medieval Europe, or even a village in parts of the world today that are non-modern. Some of us in here probably have relatives in Mexico, in rural Mexico, where they live in villages. Or maybe you have relatives in rural India, where your relatives live in villages. Or in Laos or Cambodia, where your relatives live in villages. They are living, if they are in a rural village, a pretty non-modern lifestyle, probably. And they probably have what Durkheim would call a simple division of labor. In a small village like that, you basically have two kinds of jobs. You're either a farmer or you're a craftsman of some kind. You're either out there growing crops and raising animals, or you're making some kind of simple craft like pottery or woodwork or metalwork or something like that. And so when we talk about the division of labor, who does what, well, there's really not that many choices if you're growing up in a pre-modern village. But a city is a very complicated place. City has a complex division of labor. And you have many jobs, many job categories, what are called specialties or specialization. So in a big city, and all of you are examples of a modern division of labor, if you're going to college, you don't just go to college, you have to pick a major, a special thing you're going to learn. And within that major, you probably focus on a very special particular thing that you're going to be much better at than other people. And that's what specialization means. In a modern, complicated world when you've got lots of people, people don't just have a simple choice of I'll either be a farmer or I'll be a craftsman. You have to decide, what's my career, what type of person. Like, I want to be a doctor. Well, I want to be a pediatrician. Well, I want to be an ear, nose, and throat pediatrician, specifically specializing in reconstructive surgery of ears. That's one very narrow specialty. And in the modern world, we are encouraged to find that special thing that we're really good at and do it. But what that means is in a modern city, we're all doing a bunch of different stuff. In a city, in a village, there's strong solidarity, meaning people feel connected to each other. The farmer knows he needs the craftsman, and the craftsman knows he needs the farmer, and the farmer knows he needs the blacksmith to make the horseshoes and stuff, and he needs the woodworker to make the cart and stuff like that. And they need the farmer to make the food, or we're not going to be able to eat tonight. So they're all connected in the village in that way, and they also probably all have the same religion, and the same language, and the same clothing style, and the same values and morals and outlook. They're all very similar to each other. But a city is different than that. A city, since we're all going off to do our different things, we're all very different from each other. How many of us know our neighbors? Very few of us, probably. Our neighbors have very different lifestyles. Your neighbor may make up at a totally different hour than you to go do a totally different job that you have no connection to. And, you know, I think about my neighbor's a prison guard. Well, maybe prison guard and sociologists aren't that different. I don't know. Got inmates on both sides. But I don't know. No, he works a lot differently than me. He goes and deals with criminals all day. He works 4 days out of the week, I think. He works long hours controlling people in harsh circumstances. I go off to educate the young, best and brightest of the community and stuff. So we're totally in different worlds all day long. And so how much do we have in common? Our kids might play at the same park, but other than that, and they play together. But I mean, so in the modern world, there's a lot of disconnection between people. Low solidarity. People very often have different jobs, but not only different jobs, different religions, different ethnic features. They may be different ethnic groups. They may speak different languages. They may be completely different people. So for Durkheim, this is ultimately the problem with the modern world, is that more and more we live in complex environments like a city with lots of different specialties that people are doing, and people aren't all that connected to one another. And they don't necessarily love each other or feel strongly connected to each other the way people do in a village. And according to Durkheim, this thing we call morality, this idea that certain things are okay and certain things are not okay, morality comes from your group that you're part of, the strong social group that teaches you what's right or wrong. And according to Durkheim, that's what's wrong with the modern world, is we don't feel like we're part of a strong social group. We just feel like an individual person. I wake up in my apartment, I'm all alone, I go off to my job, I come back, I don't know my neighbor, I don't really care about my coworkers, they don't really know me. We live very individualistic lives. And we don't necessarily have anyone watching over us. In a village life, the village is keeping tabs on people. And if you decide you like drinking way too much alcohol, the village is going to know about it, and they're going to disapprove, and they're going to try to get you to stop doing that. On the other hand, if you live all by yourself in an apartment and no one's watching over you, and your parents live in a whole other city, and your relatives live in a whole other city, and you're all on your own, who's to tell you how much alcohol is enough, or how much video games are enough, or how much meth you should shoot in your veins? And so Durkheim worried that, yeah, we have a morality problem in the modern world, but it's because of changes in the society where we've become disconnected from people, and we're leading very individualistic lives. So he calls the symptom of this problem anomie. Anomie means normlessness. We're going to learn about norms later. But a norm that's another word for a rule. So he's basically saying what's the symptom of what's wrong with the modern world is a sense of there are no rules. Or another way of saying it is that people are disconnected. When people are connected to each other, they know what the rules are and they obey them, and they try to anyway, or they try to get each other to obey them. But in a modern world, according to Durkheim, it's not really clear what the rules are. If I'm not connected to my village, if I'm not connected to my religion, if I'm not connected to my family, if I'm just a free-floating individual who goes to work at a factory all day and comes home to an apartment at night, then what really is my morality? Where is it supposed to come from? And Durkheim worried that people don't really have a moral compass guiding them. And so that's why people treat each other the way they do. A boss can easily mistreat a worker and say, well, I don't care how much you get paid. I'm going to pay you as little as possible, because the less I pay you, the more I make. Well, a boss could only feel that that was okay to do if you didn't feel any connection to your worker. If you felt some connection to your worker, like I care about you, I care about your children, I care about your neighborhood, if you cared about those things, you'd probably want your worker to be well paid and make sure his kids have enough and his house is well cared for and other things that you care about. But in the modern world, according to Durkheim, bosses don't necessarily care about their workers. Workers don't necessarily care about their fellow workers. People don't really care for the other person. It's all about me and me trying to get by. And if that's all it's about, then we don't really have connectedness and we don't really have morality. And so Durkheim worried that that's what the modern world has to figure out. How can we bring back morality? Because villages in the pre-modern times definitely had a sense of morality, and people knew what it was, and they knew how to follow it. And in the modern world, it seems we don't. And probably those of you who have relatives in the pre-modern world, people living in villages, they might be worried about you, especially if you're a young woman. They might say things like, I'm worried about you living in modern America over there. You're going to get involved with those drugs, or with all that sex, or all that crazy music, or you're going to go like shoot up people or something like they do there in America. And so those conservative village mentality that a lot of very traditional people have, it's the same kind of thing Durkheim is saying, that the modern world is a scary place where people don't necessarily treat each other very well. And in his mind, a society can't survive if people treat each other that way. So how can we keep our cities and our industrialization and our democracy, but bring back the kind of morality that traditional villages have? And his prognosis is further specialization. People are going to become even more specialized and even more complicated as the world becomes more technological. And he was writing well over 100 years ago. He'd be amazed at all the high-tech specialties we have now and all the training people need now to be able to take those specialized jobs in computers and all kinds of things. But what would be the cure? His idea was for what he called occupational groups. So Durkheim's cure, I'm going to put over here. Durkheim's cure is what he called occupational groups. Ultimately, the big difference between the modern world and the pre-modern world is, in the pre-modern world, there is no distinction between work and life. In pre-modern, your work life and your home life are the same thing. You wake up at a farm where you live, and you work at the farm. Or you wake up in the building connected to the blacksmith shop, and you go to the blacksmith shop, or you go work in that room. And so there isn't like going away to work. You wake up and you work in your village. But in the modern world, it's this weird thing where you sleep one place and you wake up with your family, and then you go off to work. You go away from your family to go work. And that means that our neighborhoods, where we live, has very little connection to where we work. And that means, for example, what it usually means is we live where we can afford to live. And so we have poor people all living together in poor neighborhoods. And we have middle-class people living together in middle-class neighborhoods. And we have rich people living together in rich gated communities and stuff like that. And according to Durkheim, that contributes to this disconnection. If you live in a gated community, if you're my boss, and you live in a gated community, and you never see my kids, and your kids never play with my kids, your kids only play with the other kids of rich bosses, and my kids only play with the kids of other workers, well, you don't have to care about my kids. You never had to see them. Your kids are never going to meet them. And so you're like, yeah, my workers are poor, but those are the poor people. They live on the other side of town. I don't have to worry about them. But what if you had to live in the same community as the people that work for you? What if you got to live in the same community as your boss? What if your children played with your boss's children? If life were more organized that way, according to Durkheim, people would feel more connected to one another. And they might not exploit each other the way Marx pointed to. So he was trying to imagine residential communities, people living together in residential neighborhoods like we do, but based on your occupation, based on the industry or occupation that you were part of. So for example, right now I live in Plumas Lake. That's a community down there on Highway 70. It's a lot of homeowners, but they're all homeowners. The only reason we all live there is because we could afford to buy a home. Who doesn't live there? Well, people who can afford to buy homes. You don't see very many young people, 18 to 30 there. They all live somewhere else. There's families, people that bought a home and their little children, and some old people. But we don't see young, like youth people in the 18 to 30 period, really. We don't see poor people, people that could never afford a house, people that live in apartments and work in the fields and stuff like that, or people that don't have any job. We don't see them there. We also don't see the super wealthy people that, like own the real estate company that built those homes and stuff like that. So it's a one class of people. And in fact, my boss, the chancellor of this university, this college, lives way away from where I live. He has no idea what my life is like, nor I his. But according to Durkheim, it would be better if you had, for example, instead of Plumas Lake just be middle-class homeowners, have it be like the educational community, where teachers live, and principals, and chancellors, and students, and people involved in the educational industry would live together. And then over here, maybe in the Wheatland community, instead of just having a bunch of middle-class homeowners over there, maybe that would be the military community, where people involved in the military industry live. And maybe over in Yuba City, that would be the medical community, where doctors and nurses and medical orderlies and other kinds of people live together. And once people are living together based on industry, according to Durkheim, they would begin to feel more connected to one another. And the medical administrator would feel more connected to the nurse, who would feel more connected to the doctor, and the teacher would feel more connected to the chancellor and to the students. And once people were connected in their industry, industries would start to become connected. The military community would see that they need the medical community, and the medical community needs the teachers and the educators, and they would all begin to feel connected. But he was trying to kind of bring back this idea that work and life, work and home, should be connected. They shouldn't be totally separate things. And if we could bring those back together, then we can kind of begin to bring back morality. So that was some of Durkheim's ideas. The fourth guy, or third guy, is Max Weber. I gave you their other first names. He's Max Weber. He's famous too. He's read outside of sociology. So I would say in terms of fame, Marx is most famous, Weber second, Durkheim third. Weber, if you take political science, they talk about him there. They talk about him in economics sometimes. In some ways, he's the more influential in terms of scholars. Anyway, he also thought of himself as the smartest of the three. And he had the benefit of writing after they did, so it's easy to say, well, I'm smarter than Marx and Durkheim. I see what they're saying, but here's what I say. I mean, he's kind of lucky to be the third one to go. But he also, in some ways, was more knowledgeable than Marx and Durkheim about the following thing. Marx and Durkheim basically knew European history. They studied European societies, Western societies. They didn't speak any Asian languages or African languages or study those at all. Weber studied world history, and he studied Asian history, and he was aware of Chinese history, and he studied Egyptian history and others. So he seems to be a little more knowledgeable about the variety of societies that have existed on planet Earth. So when Marx says capitalism is our problem, Weber says, well, how can that be? Because ancient Rome had capitalism. If you mean by capitalism a society where some people work for others, where some people get paid a wage and other people own the things, then you had that before. And ancient Rome didn't have some of the problems we have, like massive exploitation and inequality and stuff. So it can't just be capitalism that is the cause of our problems, according to Weber. And he looks at Durkheim's analysis and says, okay, so a complex society with lots of different jobs where people are doing different things, that's existed before. Ancient Byzantium was a very complicated place. People still talk about, oh, that's Byzantine, meaning that's really complicated. And ancient China was extremely bureaucratic with many different job specialties and many complicated relationships between the different workers and their roles in the overall Chinese system. So Weber says complexity, that's not a very new thing. That's not what makes our modern world different from previous societies. So what is it? What is distinctive about our current society that is sick, that makes it different and sick? And he points to what he calls rationalization. I'll write that over here. According to Weber, what's really new about our modern world is the emphasis placed on rationality, on being rational. And most human beings, through most of human history, haven't always been so focused on being rational. Well, what does he mean by rational, and why is it a problem? Well, right now, I would say all of the people in this room are not being fully rational. What does it mean to be rational? Can anyone give us a good definition? If somebody says, you're not being rational, what do they mean?
Realistic.
Huh? Raise your hand. Reasonable, yeah, but what does that mean to be reason? To use your reason. So to be rational means to use reason to decide things. Well, what's the opposite of reason? Or what would be a different way of deciding something other than reason? Let's make it a little more focused. Let's say you're deciding to buy a car. You could decide to buy a car based on using reason and rationality. Or you could buy a car using some other way to decide. So what would it look like to decide rationally how to buy a car? What kinds of questions would a person ask about a car if they were trying to be rational in deciding whether to buy it or not?
How much gas mileage?
Okay, why how much gas mileage?
Because if it doesn't get good gas mileage, it's going to cost you more over.
Yeah, but what if it's really cool color? I mean, Hummers don't get good gas mileage, do they? Or they get like a couple miles to the gallon. So they get like 8 miles to the gallon. So, yeah, you're right. Buying a Hummer would not necessarily be the most rational choice. And rational, what really rational means, I would say the easiest definition of it is, it's trying to maximize your gain and minimize loss. When somebody says be rational about your car, they say, well, don't spend more than you have to. Don't, minimize your loss. Don't spend more than you have to. Maximize what you get for your money. So try to get the most car you can get for your money at the least cost. So that's why mileage would be a very important thing to ask. What am I going to be spending on gas? And so a little Prius would be a more rational choice from that standpoint than a Hummer. What other rational considerations might there be besides mileage? Reliability. How much does the car cost? Am I going to spend $100,000 on a car that only lasts 3 years? Or would it be better to spend $8,000 on a car that's going to last 15 years? Should I buy a new car? Well, if I learn that new cars lose 20% of their value as soon as I drive it off the lot, maybe I'd be better off with a used car. I'm going to get the same car, just 20%, not pay 20% that just goes out the door. So those are rational calculations, but what are some other reasons why somebody would buy a car? Why would somebody buy a Hummer, even though it gets terrible gas mileage? Storage, like being able to hold stuff, yeah, but that would be rational. I need this much space, and I want to maximize how much space I can get and minimize my cost. Cool. Buying a car because it's cool, that's not all that rational. In other words, emotions are not rational. So doing things because they make you feel good, oh, this car goes really fast, it's going to be really fun to go fast. Well, that's not rational, that's emotional. You're not getting better mileage because it goes fast. You're probably going to cost more money. So anyway, yeah? That might be a consideration too. But in other words, things like the color of the car, the speed of the car, how cool it is, how much status you're going to get for it, those aren't rational considerations really. But how much mileage, how much cost, how much warranty, how long it's going to last, those are rational, sensible kinds of things to think about. And Weber's point is that in the modern world, everything is pressured to be as rational as possible. But we human beings don't always want to be completely rational. And as I was pointing out, you guys sitting in this classroom right now aren't being as rational as you could be. You TV Land people, you are being rational. Weber would be proud of you. Actually, Weber would be more proud of you guys because you guys are insisting on being human, not just being totally rational. How are they being more rational than you are?
They didn't have to come here.
It's much more efficient and rational to stay home. In fact, this college could be offering this class in a much more rational way. In fact, I should shut up because they're recording my lectures. Why hire me every semester to lecture? Why not just record my lectures and have one teacher for all the sections of Sociology 1 and make you all stay home and watch it. They could. In fact, there are now these things called MOOCs, massive online classes. Have you ever heard of those? Where you have one professor, about 100,000 students, and they're all over the world, and you pay like $100 to take the class, and the professor gets massive amounts of money from 100,000 people. That sounds good to me. Sounds pretty rational to me. I'd be better off teaching 100,000 people than teaching 7 classes of you guys. So you guys are rational. You stayed home. You saved money on car. You saved money on sitting here. You saved time. It's much more rational what they're doing. Yet you're here. You could have taken the online class. So what are you getting? You obviously see it as important. You value something aside from rationality here. If you're here, I assume you do. What is it? Human interaction. You want to be around other human beings. You feel like you learn better from a human being than from a video image of a human being. You feel like you learn better when you're hearing what other people have to say and their notes. So I think as human beings, you want a human connection to other people. And that's kind of what Weber's getting at. If you do everything totally rationally, you might drain a lot of the humanity out of it. And if things become totally rational, they might work really well in an efficiency sense. But in terms of being something human beings want to be part of, it might not be all that wonderful. And Weber, when we're looking at our modern world, he would point to all the things that have become much more rational, but in doing so haven't necessarily become better. Take, for example, medicine. Medicine is something that has become much more rationalized over the years. It used to be if you were sick, there was a guy on a horse, a doctor, who would go around the countryside and visit you at your house when you're sick. And he would take care of you at your house, the country doctor or the home visits or whatever, you know. Nowadays, you go to a health maintenance organization and they get 15 minutes with each patient. And if you can, they do the consult through the internet before you even get there. And anyway, there's all kinds of ways they're trying to maximize the number of patients that they see, maximize number of patients the hospital gets, minimize the cost. So if you can treat the patients without doctors, that would be best. Have a nurse do it, or a physician's assistant, or even better, just some kind of telemedicine where you just type in on the computer what your problem is and they type back to you what your prescription is. That's much more rational. Is it better? I don't know. A lot of people like having a human connection with their doctor. Somebody who's grown up with them, who's seen them since they were a baby, who knows what you're into, knows your personality, knows the things you're dealing with. And even the medical community is starting to realize that if you just treat people like a machine that needs to be fixed, like a car, you might not actually succeed in fixing them all that well. And that human beings need a little bit more human touch, a little more human connection to people, not just being treated like a machine. But that's what rationality ultimately does, is turn society into working like a machine, and the people in it are expected to be machine-like and robot-like in making that society work. And so Weber was really worried that rationalization was the defining feature of our modern world. That wasn't just in our economy, it isn't just our businesses that try to be as rational and maximize the money and minimize the cost. Our hospitals do that. Our education system does that. Our housing starts to do that. Go to McDonald's. McDonald's is, our food is more and more like maximize the number of people that can be fed, minimize the cost of the food, and you end up with quarter pounders with that. Maybe you like quarter pounders, but me personally, I'd rather go have my mom make me a home cooked meal. I would feel much more taken care of with a nice meal of a burger and potatoes cooked by my mom than some, frozen patties and fries at McDonald's. And McDonald's brags about their rationality. Billions and billions served, they say. Well, right now, McDonald's is actually losing money. So that tells me people are starting to turn away from this kind of robotic, and people are starting to say we want slow food, not fast food, or farm to fork. We want to know where our food came from. We want healthy food. We don't just want rational food that maximizes the amount of people fed. Anyway, so you can think about all the ways you're expected to be treated, act like a robot. You march off to your job, you march off to school, you march off to the McDonald's, you march off to the graveyard, and then you die. But Do you want to be a robot? So Mills, by the way, we talk about C. Wright Mills and the cheerful robot idea. Some of his ideas of sociology are very Weberian. He got some of them from Weber. Weber called the symptom of all this disenchantment. Modern human beings, he says, eventually become pretty disenchanted with their own society. What does disenchantment mean? Well, enchantment means magical. Something's enchanted, it's magical. And according to Weber, what the modern world does is kind of take all the magic and mystery out of life. If everything's being done scientifically and rationally, then the sort of larger fun of life gets drained out of it. And just to give you an example, in the medieval world, they often thought that forests were enchanted, meaning they thought every tree in the forest had a spirit in it, a unique spirit. This tree had a certain sylvan in it, or this tree had a different kind of spirit. Every rock had a spirit. Every animal had a spirit. And they treated the forest as a very interesting place with all kinds of uniqueness. Each tree had its own feelings, its own special character, and you could relate to each tree differently because you thought of it as a different species or different entity, each tree. Even if this is an oak tree and this is an oak tree. These two oak trees are different. They have different spirits inside them. That's a pretty magical way of thinking about a forest. But how do we think about a forest in a modern world? We just call it lumber. Oh, that's lumber. We could cut that down and make stuff out of it. We don't think of each tree as a unique, special being. We think of it as just lumber, and we just clear cut it. And then we got rid of that lumber. We better go plant some more lumber. Well, I don't know about you, but I would rather think about trees as unique beings on planet Earth, sharing planet Earth with me, rather than thinking of them as just lumber to be exploited for our own purposes. But that's just one example. A lot of examples we could give of, well, obviously you would be disenchanted by sitting in front of your computer, taking notes on what a computer-generated image of me was telling you. You somehow want to feel more connected to the people you're learning from and the people you're learning with. And so that feeling of I'm feeling lonely, isolated, like what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? Those are disenchanted feelings. And according to Weber, a lot of us in our daily lives in the modern world begin to feel that kind of disenchantment. Like, why am I here? What's the point of my life? Why do I exist? Just to get up each day and go serve burgers at McDonald's to other people whose lives are meaningless? Well, according to Durkheim, Weber, that's a dangerous situation, and people begin to feel like their lives have no purpose and no meaning. That's why people then do things like go into the mall and shoot themselves in the head, or go to the mall and shoot a bunch of other people in the head. And so Weber is worried that this overly rationalized world will lead people to do very irrational, emotional things. And so we'll come back to talking about Weber and the Founding Fathers on Monday. Have a good weekend. Don't be too irrational, I guess.